I'm Anaya Brooks, 48 years old, and 2 years ago, the nightmare my mom used to warn me about came to life in supposedly progressive communities. I thought I understood discrimination, but what happened when I tried to open my bakery showed me how the system works to keep Black women entrepreneurs out, even when they follow every rule. But what happened next taught me something even more important about the power of real allyship and community solidarity. If you've ever felt like you had to work twice as hard to be seen as half as good, please let me know where you're watching from and subscribe to join others who understand this experience. When I first moved to Millbrook 15 years ago, this small college town in Vermont felt like a breath of fresh air. I was escaping a corporate job in Boston that had left me feeling drained and invisible, despite my MBA and years of climbing the ladder. My ex-husband and I had decided to make a fresh start somewhere our daughter could grow up with clean air and good schools. Millbrook, with its farmers markets, yoga studios, and coffee shops filled with laptops, seemed perfect. The real estate agent, a bubbly woman named Jennifer, who drove a Subaru covered in coexist stickers, kept talking about how diverse and welcoming the community was. She pointed out the Ethiopian restaurant on Main Street and the meditation center run by a woman from India as proof of their inclusivity. I fell in love with our Victorian house on Maple Street immediately. The wraparound porch reminded me of my grandmother's house in North Carolina, and I could picture myself drinking coffee there on summer mornings. Our neighbors, the Andersons, brought over homemade cookies the day we moved in. Bob Anderson worked at the college, and his wife Susan ran a small nonprofit. They seemed genuinely excited to welcome us and asked thoughtful questions about our move. When I mentioned my love of baking, Susan's eyes lit up. "You have to try the farmers market," she said. "People here really appreciate artisanal foods." That first year, I started bringing my grandmother's pound cake recipe to neighborhood potlucks, and people raved about it. "Anaya, you should sell these," became a common refrain. For the first 5 years, Millbrook felt like everything I'd hoped for. My daughter Zoe thrived at the elementary school, making friends easily and falling in love with the outdoor education program. I found my rhythm working as a financial consultant for small businesses, a job that let me help local entrepreneurs while learning about the community's economic landscape. I joined the Parent-Teacher Association, volunteered at the library's literacy program, and even served on the planning committee for the annual Fall Festival. People knew me at the grocery store, waved when I walked downtown, and genuinely seemed happy to see me. I felt like I belonged. The golden period lasted from year 5 to year 10. By then, I was established enough to launch my own consulting firm, Brooks Financial Solutions. My client list included the organic farm that supplied half the restaurants in town, the bookstore everyone loved, and several professors starting side businesses. I was making real money, had genuine friendships, and felt confident about my place in the community. My typical day involved checking emails from my home office, meeting clients at the charming cafe downtown, and often running into people I knew on every errand. I started dreaming bigger, imagining what it would look like to open my own bakery. Every holiday season, friends begged me to make my grandmother's sweet potato pie, and I joked that I should just open a shop. But it didn't feel like a joke anymore. It felt like the natural next step in a life that was finally falling into place. The warning signs were subtle at first, so small I barely registered them. Like how the conversation would shift slightly when I walked into a room at PTA meetings, or how I always seemed to be the one asked to take notes, even when I wasn't the secretary. There was the time my business proposal for the fall festival was overlooked in favor of a nearly identical one from Jennifer, the real estate agent, or how clients would sometimes seem surprised by my expertise, as if they'd expected something different when they hired Brooks Financial. I noticed I was often the only Black person at community events, but I told myself that was just demographics, not exclusion. When the bank required extra documentation for my business loan renewal while approving my white colleague's application in a single meeting, I wondered briefly if race was a factor, then pushed the thought away. I'd worked too hard and come too far to start seeing discrimination where there might just be bureaucracy. The day everything became clear started like any other Tuesday in March. I was finally ready to take the leap and open Anaya's Kitchen, my dream bakery. I'd spent months developing a business plan, securing funding, and finding the perfect location on Main Street. The space had housed 3 different restaurants in the past decade, but I could see its potential: exposed brick walls, large windows facing the street, and enough room for both a cafe area and a commercial kitchen. I'd done my research, met with the city planning department twice, and felt confident my application was thorough and professional. I remember walking into City Hall that morning feeling nervous but excited, wearing my lucky navy blazer and carrying a leather portfolio my mother had given me for my MBA graduation. The marble floors echoed with my heels as I approached the licensing department. Martha Harrison, the department head I'd met with previously, looked up from her desk with what I thought was a welcoming smile. "Anaya, right on time," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "I've reviewed your application, and we need to discuss some concerns." My first instinct was optimism. Concerns meant details to work out, not roadblocks. I'd been through enough business applications to know that initial feedback was normal. Martha opened my file and spread several documents across her desk. "The planning committee has some questions about whether your proposed business aligns with our community standards," she said, her tone measured and professional. "Specifically, there are concerns about noise levels, traffic patterns, and whether this type of establishment fits with the character of the downtown area." I felt my chest tighten slightly, but I stayed focused. "I understand those are important considerations," I replied. "My business plan includes detailed projections for foot traffic, and I've designed the space to minimize noise. I also researched successful bakeries in similar communities." Martha nodded but didn't look convinced. "There's also the matter of parking," she continued. "Some residents have expressed concerns about limited street parking being further reduced." This struck me as odd since the previous restaurants hadn't required additional parking permits, but I kept my voice steady. "I'm happy to work with the planning committee on any parking solutions they recommend." As our conversation continued, a pattern emerged. Every aspect of my proposal that had been approved for previous businesses in that same location was suddenly a potential problem. The early morning deliveries that the breakfast place had managed for 3 years were now a noise concern. The outdoor seating that the Italian restaurant had used every summer was now a sidewalk obstruction issue. When I mentioned these precedents, Martha's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Every business is different, Anaya. We have to evaluate each application on its own merits." The way she said my name made something cold settle in my stomach. That evening, I called my sister Denise in Atlanta, a lawyer who'd navigated her own share of professional challenges as a Black woman. I described the meeting, trying to keep my voice neutral, but Denise picked up on my frustration immediately. "Baby girl, that doesn't sound right," she said. "Same location, same type of business, but suddenly there are all these new concerns. You need to document everything." Part of me wanted to believe this was just bureaucratic inefficiency, but Denise's experience had taught her to recognize patterns I was still learning to see. "I'm not saying it's definitely racial bias," she said carefully, "but it's worth paying attention to." I spent that night researching every business that had opened in downtown Millbrook over the past 5 years. The Ethiopian restaurant Martha had mentioned as an example of community diversity, it was actually in a strip mall outside the downtown core, the Meditation Center, housed in a converted residential property, not a commercial space. Every business that had opened on Main Street in the past decade had been owned by white entrepreneurs. The data was clear, even if the intentions weren't. Over the next 2 weeks, I experienced a pattern of obstacles that felt both systematic and personal. Each time I addressed one concern from the planning committee, 2 more appeared. The ventilation system that had been adequate for the previous restaurant now needed expensive upgrades. My business license application was missing forms that hadn't been mentioned in any of my previous conversations. When I asked for clarification on requirements, I was directed to different departments that gave conflicting information. The most revealing moment came during a planning committee meeting that was supposed to be routine approval for businesses that had addressed initial concerns. I arrived early, wearing my most professional outfit and carrying a binder with responses to every question that had been raised. The meeting was held in the council chambers at City Hall, a wood-paneled room that usually felt welcoming but now seemed formal and intimidating. I was the only applicant on the agenda, though typically these meetings covered multiple businesses. 6 committee members sat at a horseshoe-shaped table, with Martha Harrison presenting my case. As she began outlining the concerns that had been raised, I noticed something that made my heart race. Every single concern she mentioned had been addressed in my supplemental materials, but she was presenting them as if I had never responded. When she finished, Committee Chair Robert Chen asked if I had anything to add. I stood, feeling the weight of 6 pairs of eyes on me, and calmly walked through each point Martha had raised, referencing the documents I'd submitted. I provided noise impact studies from similar bakeries in comparable communities, I said, pulling out the relevant pages. I outlined traffic flow solutions that have worked in other downtown settings. I even included a letter from my insurance company confirming that my proposed operations align with standard commercial baking coverage. As I spoke, I watched the committee members' faces. Some looked surprised, as if they were hearing this information for the first time. Others glanced at Martha with expressions I couldn't quite read. Robert Chen cleared his throat and looked at Martha. "Were these materials not included in our packets?" he asked. Martha shuffled through papers on her desk, her cheeks reddening slightly. "I believe there may have been some organizational issues with the supplemental materials," she said. "Perhaps we should table this application until next month to ensure everyone has complete information." I felt my carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. 3 months of work, multiple meetings, and detailed responses to every concern. And my materials had somehow been organizationally misplaced. That's when Susan Anderson spoke up. I hadn't noticed her in the back of the room until that moment. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, standing. "But I attended several planning meetings for the Italian restaurant that previously occupied this space. Anaya's application is far more detailed than what we typically require, and she's addressed concerns that weren't raised for other businesses." The room went completely silent. Susan continued, her voice steady but firm. "I think we need to be careful that we're applying consistent standards to all applicants." After the meeting, Susan walked with me to the parking lot. "I'm sorry, Anaya," she said. "I should have spoken up sooner. I've been watching this process, and it's not right." We stood under the streetlight, and I felt tears I'd been holding back for weeks finally surface. "I keep thinking maybe I'm paranoid," I said. "Maybe I'm seeing racism where it's just bureaucracy." Susan shook her head firmly. "You're not paranoid. I've lived here for 20 years and served on various committees. I've never seen an application process like this for a downtown business." That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I started documenting not just my own experience, but the broader pattern of business approvals in Millbrook. I requested public records for every commercial license application in the downtown area for the past decade. I researched the composition of the planning committee and their voting patterns. Most importantly, I started talking to other business owners about their application experiences. What I discovered was a system that worked perfectly for some people and created endless obstacles for others. White business owners I spoke with described straightforward application processes, helpful city staff, and reasonable timelines. The few business owners of color I found had stories similar to mine, moving targets, misplaced paperwork, and requirements that seemed to multiply. The Ethiopian restaurant owner, Bekele, had given up on his dream of downtown location after months of similar runaround. They always had good reasons, he told me, but somehow the good reasons never applied to other people. I also learned that Martha Harrison had been with the city for over 15 years and had considerable influence over the planning committee's decisions. Several committee members were relatively new and relied heavily on her expertise and recommendations. When I cross-referenced her tenure with business approvals, a disturbing pattern emerged. Under her guidance, the planning department had successfully maintained the downtown area as an exclusively white-owned business district. The breakthrough came when I connected with Dr. Patricia Williams, a sociology professor at the college who had been researching economic development in small Vermont towns. She'd been tracking patterns of business ownership and had noticed Millbrook's unusual homogeneity. "It's not accidental," she told me, over coffee at the same cafe where I'd imagined hosting my own customers. "Small-town discrimination often works through procedural barriers rather than explicit exclusion. It's harder to prove, but just as effective." Dr. Williams introduced me to Sarah Chen, Robert Chen's daughter, who worked as a civil rights attorney in Burlington. Sarah reviewed my documentation and immediately recognized what she called procedural discrimination. She explained how seemingly neutral processes could be weaponized to maintain exclusion while providing plausible deniability. "The key," she said, "is showing the pattern. Individual incidents can be explained away, but patterns reveal intent." With Sarah's help, I prepared a comprehensive presentation that would lay out not just my experience, but the broader pattern of exclusion in Millbrook's business district. We scheduled a public hearing for the next planning committee meeting, knowing that transparency and community witness would be essential. Sarah advised me to focus on facts rather than emotions, patterns rather than individual grievances, and solutions rather than just problems. The week before the hearing, something unexpected happened. Susan Anderson had been talking to her neighbors about my situation, and word began to spread through Millbrook's networks. I started receiving calls and emails from community members I barely knew. Some shared their own observations about inconsistent city processes. Others offered to attend the hearing in support. Dr. Williams reached out through her academic networks, and several colleagues expressed interest in attending. By the day of the hearing, I realized I wouldn't be facing the planning committee alone. The council chambers filled with familiar faces from the farmer's market, the library, my daughter's school, and places I shopped. People I'd worked with professionally, sat next to neighbors I'd only waved to in passing. The Ethiopian restaurant owner, Bekele, was there with his wife. Professor Williams brought 3 colleagues who studied municipal policy. Sarah Chen sat in the front row with a briefcase full of documentation. When Martha Harrison called the meeting to order, her usual confident demeanor seemed shaken by the crowd. She announced that they would be hearing Anaya Brooks' business license application, along with some concerns that had been raised about the process. I had prepared extensively for this moment, but seeing so many supportive faces made me feel stronger than I'd expected. I stood at the podium with my presentation materials organized and my voice steady. "Thank you for allowing me to address the committee today," I began. "I'm here not just to request approval for my bakery, but to highlight some concerning patterns in how business applications are processed in our community." I clicked to my first slide, which showed a map of downtown Millbrook with business ownership demographics clearly marked. In the past 10 years, 32 businesses have opened in the downtown core, I continued. 31 are owned by white entrepreneurs. One, the Ethiopian restaurant, was initially approved for a downtown location, but eventually opened outside the core area after facing similar procedural challenges to what I've experienced. I could hear murmurs from the audience and see committee members shifting in their seats. My next slides detailed the specific obstacles I'd encountered, comparing them to the documented experiences of other applicants. I showed how requirements had changed between my initial meeting and my formal application. I presented evidence of supplemental materials that had been submitted but not shared with the committee. Most damaging, I demonstrated how the same concerns that were blocking my application had not been raised for previous businesses in the identical location. "I want to be clear," I said, looking directly at each committee member. "I'm not questioning anyone's conscious intentions, but the pattern of outcomes speaks for itself. When the same process consistently produces the same demographic result, we have to examine whether the process itself is equitable." Robert Chen looked visibly uncomfortable as I presented documentation of applications his committee had approved without the level of scrutiny mine had received. When I finished my presentation, he asked Martha Harrison to respond to the specific procedural questions I'd raised. Her explanation was rambling and defensive, full of phrases like extraordinary circumstances and unique considerations that didn't address the documented inconsistencies. That's when Dr. Williams requested permission to address the committee. She presented her research on economic development patterns in Vermont towns, contextualizing Millbrook's situation within broader regional trends. "What Ms. Brooks has documented here is not unusual," she said. "Small communities across New England have maintained economic exclusion through procedural barriers. The question is whether Millbrook wants to continue this pattern or become a model for inclusive economic development." Bekele spoke next, sharing his experience with the downtown location that eventually became impossible to secure. His quiet dignity and clear documentation of similar procedural roadblocks reinforced the pattern I'd outlined. When he finished, several community members requested to speak. One by one, neighbors, customers, and friends stepped forward to voice their support for my business and their concerns about the process I'd endured. The most powerful moment came when Susan Anderson approached the podium. "I've lived in Millbrook for 20 years, she said. "I've served on this planning committee, the school board, and various volunteer committees. I know this community's values, and I know when those values aren't being reflected in our actions." She paused, looking around the packed room. "Anaya Brooks has done everything we ask of business owners. She's been professional, thorough, and patient. The obstacles she's faced aren't about community standards. They're about who we think belongs in our community." The room erupted in applause that lasted nearly a minute. When it finally died down, Susan continued. "I move that we approve Anaya's business license tonight, and that we also commit to reviewing our application processes to ensure they're equitable for all future applicants." The applause resumed, even louder this time. Committee member Jennifer Walsh, who had been silent throughout the hearing, finally spoke. "I've been reviewing the documentation Ms. Brooks provided, and I have to agree that the process seems inconsistent with how we've handled other applications." She looked at Martha Harrison with obvious discomfort. "I think we need to vote on this application tonight, and we also need to have a broader conversation about our procedures." Robert Chen called for a vote on my business license application. The result was unanimous approval, with Martha Harrison abstaining. As the gavel fell, the room exploded in cheers and applause. I felt overwhelmed by emotion, relief, gratitude, vindication, and exhaustion, all hitting me at once. Sarah Chen squeezed my shoulder and whispered, "You did it. You actually did it." But the real victory went beyond my individual approval. The committee voted to establish a community review board for business applications, ensuring transparency and consistency in future processes. They also mandated annual reporting on business ownership demographics and approval patterns. Most significantly, they committed to providing mentorship and support for minority business owners navigating the application process. In the months that followed, Anaya's Kitchen became more than just my dream realized. The bakery opened 6 months later to lines around the block, with people eager to support not just my business but the principle it represented. My grandmother's pound cake and sweet potato pie became local legends, but more importantly, the space became a gathering place for conversations about community, inclusion, and what it means to truly welcome everyone. The changes at City Hall were slower but significant. Martha Harrison took early retirement, and the new planning director implemented the transparency measures that had been promised. 2 more minority-owned businesses opened downtown within the next year, both navigating processes that were documented, consistent, and fair. The Community Review Board, made up of residents from diverse backgrounds, provided oversight that ensured accountability. Personally, the experience transformed how I understand my role in the community. Fighting for my bakery taught me that belonging isn't something that's given, it's something you claim and defend. I learned the difference between performative allyship and genuine solidarity, recognizing the neighbors who showed up when it mattered. Most importantly, I discovered that speaking truth about discrimination doesn't divide communities. It creates opportunities for healing and growth. The ripple effects continued long after my license was approved. Dr. Williams published a case study about Millbrook's transformation that became a model for other small towns addressing similar issues. Beakley successfully opened a second location downtown, and his Ethiopian restaurant became one of the most popular spots on Main Street. The Community Review Board expanded its mandate to include other municipal processes, ensuring that the lessons learned from my experience extended beyond business licensing. My relationship with the community deepened in ways I hadn't expected. The neighbors who had supported me became genuine friends, and our conversations about race and inclusion continued long after the crisis passed. My daughter Zoe, now in high school, has grown up understanding both the challenges and the possibilities of being a Black person in a predominantly white community. She's confident in her belonging because she watched me fight for mine. The experience also taught me about the long-term nature of social change. Real progress requires sustained attention and continued vigilance. The systems that created exclusion don't disappear overnight, and the people committed to maintaining them often adapt their strategies. But the community's response to my situation proved that there are always people willing to stand up for what's right when they understand what's at stake. Looking back now, I understand that what happened to me wasn't really about a business license. It was about power, belonging, and who gets to shape the economic future of our communities. The procedural barriers I faced were designed to discourage me from even trying, and when that didn't work, to exhaust me into giving up. But underestimating the power of community solidarity was their biggest mistake. If you're facing similar challenges, here's what I learned that might help you. First, document everything. Keep records of every conversation, every email, every requirement that's mentioned. Patterns become clear when you have facts to support your experience. Second, research the broader context. Your individual experience likely reflects systemic issues that can be identified and addressed. Third, build relationships before you need them. The allies who supported me were people I'd been building genuine connections with for years. Most importantly, don't let anyone convince you that discrimination is acceptable just because it's procedural or polite. Exclusion wrapped in professional language is still exclusion. Your dreams, your contributions, and your presence in the community matter. When you fight for yourself, you're also fighting for everyone who comes after you. For those of you who want to be genuine allies, here's what made the difference in my situation. The people who helped me most were those who used their privilege and platform to amplify my voice, rather than speaking for me. They did the work to understand the patterns I was experiencing, and they were willing to speak up even when it was uncomfortable. Real allyship means being willing to risk your own comfort and relationships to support equity and justice. If you're in a position of institutional power, examine your processes for hidden barriers. Ask yourself whether your community standards consistently exclude certain groups, and be willing to change systems that produce inequitable outcomes. Inclusivity isn't just about good intentions, it requires intentional action and ongoing accountability. The fight for economic inclusion in our communities isn't finished. There are still barriers to overcome, systems to change, and dreams to defend. But what happened in Millbrook proves that transformation is possible when people are willing to stand up for their values and work together for change. Anaya's Kitchen is thriving now, serving as both a successful business and a symbol of what's possible when communities choose inclusion over exclusion. Every morning when I unlock the door and turn on the ovens, I think about my grandmother, whose recipes started this journey, and about my daughter, who will inherit a community that's a little more just because we were willing to fight for it. If my story resonates with you, please share it with others who might need to hear it. Subscribe to stay connected with our community of people working for change, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what challenges you're facing in your own community. Together, we can build a world where everyone's dreams have room to flourish. Remember, your voice matters, your dreams are valid, and your community is better when everyone has a place at the table. Keep fighting, keep building, and keep believing that change is possible, because it is.